Come. Okay. This is the second lecture, public lecture that we are having this time in collaboration with the US Embassy. Last time, I don't know whether you're here, some of you must have been. We had Professor Ashish Nandi from CSDS Delhi, who came here to talk again on issues of genocide. Today we have Professor Sue Gronewold. Before I introduce Sue, let me talk a little bit of Center for Genocide Studies. This is a Center for Genocide of University of Dhaka under Faculty of Social Sciences. Was established now, 3 years, but as you know, university takes time in getting rooms, in appointing the director, in all the formalities. Sometimes it can be very, very slow. But the interesting thing is that we have a center after 40 years almost, if you take 71. And this, more for Sue's information, this is the epicenter of genocide. The genocide in 71 began at Dhaka University. And probably this is the only university in the world, I think, which can be looked at as the epicenter of genocide. In other instances, you had other establishment, but here, as you know, the Pakistan military forces attacked, making a documentary or something, so we had to make it 51. But our idea probably next time to get it down to 40, in fact, from my side, it people who are involved in the international war crime that we are now having, the tribunal. We had Turin Afroz, we had Dr. Kamal Hussain, not to mention we'll be having Shadin Malik. So we have series of personalities, in fact, who are otherwise well versed on legal issues, on political issues, and we had people from other disciplines, including from economics. We had Binayak Shen come here to talk about Russian genocide. So, and it's an international kind of thing, and it's not 71. We had the Armenian genocide, we had Rwanda genocide, not to mention the other genocides throughout the world. And Professor Sue Gronewold came all the way from Keene University, first to speak to the students on the Holocaust. We thought that better to have someone who's more familiar with the Holocaust. And so we thought of Keene University, and it's quite an honor for us that she took all the way, lost her luggage actually for a while, but managed to get the luggage. So anyway, she finally made it, in fact. And so, as I said, the diploma course, the idea is to have it graduated to a master's program after 2 or 3 diploma courses. That's the idea. We will be launching a fellowship very quickly, in fact. We got a good grant from a local business house, and we will be probably, most likely in month of January, we'll have a research fellowship introduced. So that's one part of it. The other thing that we are starting is an advanced certificate course on human rights, which we also thought would be very, very relevant to something that we'll be doing, some of the things. I will not go very far. Let me introduce a little bit of Professor Sue Gronewold. She is now based in Keene University, Professor of History, also now in charge of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene University. It's quite vast in terms of some of the things that he has done over the years. She is almost a Chinese expert, I would say, a little bit.
Pales in comparison to you.
No, no. So she's very familiar with China, not to mention on gender issues, and Asia, and not to mention also very familiar with India. And for her passionate plea, we had to make an arrangement for her to go all the way to Kushtia. In fact, tomorrow she's heading for Lalon Utsav. She said, I must see Lalon Utsav. So she's going there, and she said, you must make me go via Shilai Daho. So my young faculty said, okay, Prof, it will be done. So her passion for Lalon and for Tagore is immense. So with that little intro, today she's going to talk about genocide in Asia. 30, 40, 40 minutes, 45 minutes, would that be okay for you?
Fine.
Okay,
Fine.
and then we'll have an
Yes.
interaction. So it's all yours.
Great. Thank you. Do my thanks, and it's been a whirlwind trip, 4 days, but I have to say the people who sponsored me, both Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed and the University of Dhaka and its International Relations Department, the Center for Genocide Studies, combined with the extraordinary people at the U.S. Embassy, Shaheen Khan and Calvin Hayes, who are sitting here, the two of them together, because those three people have enormous energy, lots of things that they do themselves, and so that combined meant that these 4 days have really been packed. A lecture at least a day, and many, many other things. So I want to thank them, though, for giving me this introduction, my first time in Bangladesh. I've not been here before. So I've been in other parts of South Asia, but I've never been in Bangladesh. And so I want to thank you very much for introducing me to it and giving me such a full packed schedule and all these experiences. And I thank all of you for coming. I'm really learning about Bangladesh. I do teach about Asia, and I'll talk a little bit about that in our program, but I don't know that much about Bangladesh. People in the United States don't know much about Bangladesh. Where I live in New Jersey, I live in New York City, but I teach in New Jersey, and there's a sizable Bangladeshi community close to my school. So I happen to be privileged in order to be able to meet people from Bangladesh, but so being here really puts all that together. So thank you very much for, giving me this opportunity to visit first and, begin to learn about Bangladesh. And so I will offer some comments about other things that I've done around this issue of genocide and memory. History and memory is a field within the history profession now. And so I'm going to be offering comments not from Bangladesh because that's not my specialty, but from other parts of Asia, and really see these as kind of introductory comments, and then I want to hear from you and you continue to teach me about Bangladesh. So I see this as really a dialogue. I'm offering comments, but it's really as a way to get conversations started. As Professor Ahmed said, I'm actually an historian, and so my training is in history. It's actually in East Asian history. I have a PhD in modern Chinese history from Columbia University, so I'm very familiar with East Asia. But I also have, one of the hats that I wear is I was, as chair of the history department, we had an American history course as our required course on campus, which I thought that's really ridiculous to have just our students learn only about American history. And so I lobbied, before I was chair, I lobbied to have it be world history. And then the first year that I got to be chair, I was able to require it. So our required course, every student, 2,000 students a year, have to take a course in world history. What world history, which is being done, it's developed into an interesting field. And what that really allows you to do is think broadly. I mean, you do a couple of things with it. What you do is you compare, but it also allows you to think broadly in a way that has to be done. We're just talking about water issues. You can't talk about water issues without thinking about regions. You can't talk about migration without thinking about regions, about worldwide phenomena. So I think it's really useful in any issue to look at it comparatively. And so I'm going to offer comments from a couple parts of Asia. Looking at comparatively allows you to see similarities, but it also sharpens differences. And so I'm really very much in favor of having that kind of an approach, whatever it is, in thinking about history. Another thing that I do at Kane is I was one of the people who started our Holocaust and Genocide master's program. We have a master's program where you actually can get a degree in Holocaust and Genocide studies. The program, actually, before I got involved in discussing it, the program came out of we have a Holocaust Resource Center. We have a Holocaust kind of certificate program for teachers in the community. State of New Jersey requires teachers to teach about the Holocaust. It's actually a legal requirement that at some point in the year they have to talk about the Holocaust. And so coming not out of the Holocaust Center, but coming out of the history department, I said, wait just a minute, you can't just have this requirement, this training be on Holocaust, you have to bring in other genocides. And so it's Holocaust Genocide Studies, and I teach in that. I developed a course on the history of genocide in Asia, and then I'm teaching a course now that I developed on comparative genocides. So, I'm very comfortable with making those kind of comparisons, or starting to make those kind of comparisons. So I'll share those with you. One last comment about it, just to kind of make it clear, and we talked about this a lot I've talked this out with students here, and that is a little bit of the background, why it is that a program in the United States might be privileging the Holocaust. Why is it that it started with the Holocaust, added other genocides to it, but the program is built up in a way that the core courses for the students in the Holocaust Genocide program are Holocaust courses. And the argument is that the Holocaust was unique and arguable. It may not be something everyone agrees with. It's certainly a contested argument. But the argument is that the Holocaust was something that was so beyond the bounds of what people should do to each other. And when we think about how to define a genocide, new term in the 20th century, so not lots of agreement about what it is, but UN Convention, international law. When you talk about genocide, the important part of the definition of it is that it should be something which is massive, great scale, which is state supported, driven, and also which is modern and industrial. So it's really seen as a modern phenomenon. People have massively killed each other, since beginning of time. But there's something different, the argument is. There's something different about the 20th century. And Hitler's Germany was able to, with modern technologies, kill people, intend to kill people, deliberately, systematically kill people on a scale that was unprecedented. So that's the argument for why it's unique and why our program starts with Holocaust, and the students take all their core courses in Holocaust studies and then add other genocides to that comparatively. But just to underscore one last point, and then we can talk about it if you want to, but one last point is that in effect, if you look at the history of the Holocaust, is that Hitler was successful. He was basically successful with it. This modern, systematic, technological, the best minds of Germany, determining how to get rid of the Jews, and they basically wiped out 2/3 of the Jews in Europe. The small towns in Poland, in Russia, that were filled with Jews don't exist. That life is gone. I was in Vienna last year and Berlin. Those were towns with a very vibrant Jewish intellectual, cultural life. That's gone. It's totally gone. So Hitler, in a sense, was successful at it, and so that's why there's a separate term for it, and why a program like mine might be privileging it and looking at it as the kind of the genocide, and then comparing it and investigating it from there. So that is how we developed our program. Then in 2009, probably I don't recall exactly, but probably in preparation for the 2011 anniversary, we were approached in the history department and the Holocaust program. We were approached by the people from the Bangladeshi community, and there are many Bangladeshis on our staff and faculty. We were approached by them to do a conference. So for me, coming here is kind of coming full circle. So in 2009, we did a conference on 1971 at Kane University. And we had, it was really an extraordinary conference because we had people who were political people, ambassadorial level people. We had legal scholars, top legal scholars. We had historians, people working on gender issues. Wonderful group of scholars came together. But in addition to having the legal, the scholars, the political people, we also invited people from the community who had experienced, who were freedom fighters, some people who had experienced violence during that period, who were encouraged to tell their stories. And because it was we were just talking about it, because it was clearly an environment where people felt supported and encouraged, there were many people, particularly women, older women, who had experienced violence, who felt comfortable talking about it. And we scheduled, I think it was like 2 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that. And it was one of those things where you had to keep changing the schedule, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, because people started telling their stories and they didn't stop. Their children had never heard the stories, their husbands had never heard the stories, their neighbors had never heard the stories. And so it was, extraordinarily moving, deeply moving, and it was something that was not expected for that to happen, but it was really unprecedented. And we also had people from Liberation War Museum who came. So coming here, one of the nice things that I was able to do was to go and look at Liberation War Museum to see the posters that had been brought to New Jersey in the site at the Liberation War Museum, and to get a very intensive tour of it here. It's a museum which is, you should be aware that this museum is one that's known around the world as a kind of a model of its kind that does tell all those stories, and is not only involved in collecting material, and they have so much of it, but also in the public history part of it. I've worked in museums myself, and so I'm very committed to public history and going out of the museum. And so the notion that they have, the mobile vans going out to schools, going out to the community, to me is a piece of it that oftentimes museum people, historians don't do. But, so it was very nice to actually go to the museum and to meet people. So, I've kind of come full circle, I feel, and re-met the people who I had met 4 years ago. Talk a little bit about a couple of case studies from Asia as a way to get into this topic. And there are so many things one can talk about in terms of genocide and Holocaust. But if we want to make sense of it, and supposedly humans are meaning-making people or creatures, if we want to make sense of it, we have to have a plan, a kind of a deliberate way to go about making sense of it. These are phenomena, the Holocaust, genocide. They're phenomena that are beyond categories. That's part of the nature of them. That they're not something that's supposed to happen. They're beyond imagination. They are, and a word I've been using lately a lot is ferocious. There's a ferocity about them, the brutality that is, beyond acceptable. But we want to try to make meaning out of them, and because, and I'll say this many times, because our goal in doing this, the reason we're here together, the reason the Liberation War Museum exists, the ultimate reason is so that it doesn't happen again. The Spanish is nunca más, never again, title of books and everything on Latin American atrocities. So if we want indeed it not to happen again, recognizing that people do this to each other and have always, but if you want to try to limit it, then we want to be able to be systematic and have a way to go about studying it and be able to come to some kind of agreement about what we're doing and the language we use, the words we use, the terms we use, and the process that we use. So genocide scholars, historians, political scientists, legal people, there are three categories that are really covered in much of the literature. And the first one is that we do one first process. They're not necessarily in steps, but usually the first process that happens is what we saw in New Jersey. What I see in the Liberation War Museum is the telling the stories, the testimonials of telling the stories about what happens, and oftentimes because of trauma, repeating the stories over and over again. I was just telling Shaheen that we had a conversation. We had a little mini conference one day on Cambodia, letting us know what was happening. There had been some event that had happened in the tribunal there, and we had some legal people come, and then we had this woman, Liang Ung, who I think lives in New Jersey, who wrote a book called First They Killed My Father, and it's her family story in Cambodia. And she told the story, and she's very vibrant and very well-spoken, and I was careful about it. I tried to frame my question carefully. I said, this is the story that you told, you're telling the story that's in your book. What are you going to do next? And she exploded. She exploded at me. And she said, this is what I do. I survived. My father didn't. My mother didn't. My brother and sister didn't. She said, what I have to do for the rest of my life is tell this story. And ferocity. It was a ferocious response that she had said, I have to do this. I have to tell it over and over again to new people, whatever, that's my job, that's my role, and that's my mission. I have to tell this story. So the truth telling, getting the truth out, getting to it by telling stories is the first process. And I see that here. I see it in the other examples I'll be talking about. But this notion of getting to the truth of it, getting the facts out, getting to the truth of it. And there's a lot of discussion by historians, by other people about what is the truth? Is there one truth? Who owns the truth? Whose story do we tell? Whose story do we privilege? When we make the monuments, when we make a mural, when we make go to the next step in terms of trying to come to some kind of justice, are there stories that we privilege? My husband does work on Latin America. He's a Latin American historian, and he just finished 4 books on South American, the movement to the military period, from the military period to the end of the military period in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Peru. And he tells the story of the officers in Argentina are now saying, because there's been such attention to the survivors and what happened in the military period, and all those countries are filled with museums, memorial sites. I mean, you can go to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, and there is a map. I guess there's one here also. There's a map. There's a map you can follow, thousands of places. This living room, that church basement, and so enormous amount of attention. The officers in Argentina are now saying, wait just a minute, what about our story? We were victims too. They make the argument. It's an outrageous argument, but they're saying, if you're going to tell stories, we got stories too. And so this whole notion of whose story is it, whose story do you privilege? When you do a memorial, and I'll be looking at memorials, when you do a memorial, should the survivors be the ones who basically are the ones to determine what the memorial looks like? And in many cases, there has been this argument that they're the ones who should be, it's their story that should be privileged more than other people's. And then the issue of once the survivors are no longer alive, and certainly for the Holocaust, for certainly Nanjing, the story I'm going to talk about in China, you have the children of survivors. Their story, are their stories privileged? Because they grew up with this. Psychologists are beginning to talk about generational memory, generational trauma. Do you privilege their stories also? Not easy, and there's no easy answer to these. They have to be brought up in each case, kind of wrangled over. But these are some of the things that come up in talking about history and memory. Not the same thing. Truth-telling, how to get at it. The second process that goes on is this notion of justice, that you get the story out, and then you have to figure out somehow that justice should be served. And usually there's some kind of immediate justice that's served, but you want it to be, once you get the truth-telling, for there to be a process, for there to be a range of ways of reaching justice in different genocide situations, of truth and reconciliation, truth commissions, tribunals, etc. A whole range of it, of ways to do that, and certainly the point that is made over and over again is that you want this to be done in a way which is as fair, as careful, as just as possible, and according to international norms. So we now have lots of international norms, a whole buildup of international norms and procedures which are being contested over but used. And the third phase is hopefully some kind of closure. May not be possible, but some kind of reconciliation, closure, moving on, and not a term I particularly like, but so these are the three processes that I will look at. So let me look at just quickly three. How do I get this? Three situations. Oops. How do I go back?
You went back?
How do I go back?
You go back.
Just through? Good. There we go. Okay, so three situations quickly. The first one is in East Asia. So the first one is one which I'm familiar with. This is a part of Chinese history that I do work on in the 20th century. And this is in Nanjing. The background of it is that the Japanese had responded to imperialist demands, American demands actually, that they open up by changing their country, by becoming defensively modern, and by becoming, by early part of the 20th century, a superpower. And with that, their population grew, and the Japanese started believing that they could not live on their little islands, that they had to expand. So they justified expansion first to Manchuria, to northeastern Asia, and then the real prize was not there. The real prize was central China. So the area, and it's a delta area. It's an area, like this area, very rich agriculturally. It's also the area that was in the 20th century where you had the industrial strength of China was in this area, and the capital was there. So in 1937, the Japanese attacked Beijing, and they also attacked Shanghai on the coast and moved into to Nanjing. And expected, because there had not been a whole lot of resistance in northern China, northeastern China, and Manchuria, they expected the Chinese to say, okay, that's it, you can have it. But Chiang Kai-shek decided to fight. And so for reasons that we never have, Holocaust genocides, are they explainable? Not really. We look for factors, but for reasons we don't really understand, the Japanese soldiers behaved in an extraordinarily ferocious manner. And massacred people who were resisting them, and also the local population, just unleashed massive barbaric behavior. So in the space of a few weeks, massacred hundreds of thousands of people. Numbers are always questionable, but massacred hundreds of thousands of people. And eventually did conquer central China, had difficulty getting more of China than that, but they did conquer it. And so this was a massacre that at the time was documented. I mean, there were Western and there were journalists there. It was in the newspapers, but because the Japanese controlled the area, it clamped down. So 37 to 45, nothing known about it around the world. And after the war, Tokyo Tribunal, in the space of a couple of weeks, said, okay, there are a couple of people we're going to claim as causing this, executed some of them, and that was it. So justice was done. This whole story really did not, was not really taken up by the Chinese until later, until really the 70s and 80s, when Japan was powerful, becoming more powerful. And so the memory of it was revived, and the Chinese government basically set about remembering it, memorializing it, and basically put together a museum. This is all government funded, and had a architect who had done other memorial sites, and put together this museum. So this is how it was originally. It was done in 83, 85, and like with the Beijing Village, the Olympic Village, the Chinese decided to do it in 83, and in 85 it opened. Incredible what you can do when you have a strong central government. And so they memorialized it, and you can see here that the Chinese want to make sure that everyone knew the extent of it. You walk up to it, and 300,000. The number, which is contested, the number is emblazoned there, and you see victims in both English. Interestingly enough, a lot of the stuff is done here in English. It's going to be true also on the Japan side. So English, Chinese, and Japanese of victims. What's different about this particular is that it was top down. Obviously, there were lots of Chinese who remembered it. You talk to people in this area about the Japanese, they're very anti-Japanese, but this notion of having the site, this memorialization of it, did not come from the bottom up. It really came from top down, and then has been used. And so over the last decades, this site has been extended. It's now 3 times the size that it was. The face of it has changed now. You have this kind of river of blood is what it's supposed to show. Figures in it that are demonstrating the kind of people who were killed, not only the soldiers, many of whom were taken off their uniforms and blended with the people, but also women, children, and the number contested of how many women were raped and violated in this space of time. So the Chinese remember it, and what they do now is basically have people remember. So the Chinese government's very involved in having people remember what happened in Nanjing. There's been some government-sponsored movies made of it that have gotten a large audience. All my students have seen it because they show some of the same images over and over and over again. And you have this kind of almost, I don't know what to call it, it's this notion of the Japanese with their swords. There are certain images that come up over and over and over again, but it's very much top down. It's very much controlled by the government for their own political purposes, and very, very powerfully so. There's also a suggestion that the tourism, there's a kind of a memorial tourism, a genocide tourism, and that this makes money for the Chinese government. So I've heard that actually expressed as at least a side benefit the Chinese have, but very much top down and used to manipulate feelings in the area and justifying. China now is claiming much of the maritime waters, angering the Japanese, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, but claiming their victimhood by using this memory politically. Now, if you go to the other side of the sea, you go to Japan. How do the Japanese view this? And the Japanese play with this notion of perpetrators, victims, in their own fashion. So the Japanese story is told in this particular place. This is not top-down, at least by the government. This is private since 1945, and private, but the prime minister and officials go to this shrine, Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. And it's quite extraordinary. There's a shrine there to the martyrs, people who died for the cause of Japan from 1869 to the present. It's very controversial. It's not the bodies, it's little slips of paper with their names on them. But what it does is it commemorates not only, there are many thousands of people who are commemorated there, and I'm sorry, 2.5 million people are commemorated there, but it includes the Class A war criminals from World War II. And so every prime minister has gone there. Abe this time did not go when the other officials did. He went another time. He didn't go when the other officials did, but he did actually pay his respects to the war dead, including the war criminals. How do they talk about what was happening in Japan, in China? You go into the shrine and into the museum part of it. And the museum part of it has it's an area that's about this size. It's a shrine, it's like a church, it's reverential. Big long scrolls, very powerful music, evocative music playing, very powerful images. And then you walk through this kind of sacred space almost that the Japanese have created, and there's a story. And the story is, the very first room is called Western Powers Encroach on Asia. And it tells a story of imperialism and how Western powers took over, brought Great China to its knees. The Japanese decided not to have that happen to them, but they defensively reacted to it, and then went on to help save the rest of Asia from imperialists. There are 2 rooms devoted to the Russo-Japanese War that they were able to, because they had defensively modernized, they were able to defeat Russia, Western power. And there's also, it's a military museum. And then at the end of it, what the Japanese have is a discussion about Nanjing, and they don't talk about it as a massacre. And there are, at present, there's a lot of Japanese historians who work on this period, but their interest in it is to defend what they did and to minimize it. So China has 300,000. There is a group of people, a group of scholars. They're trained, highly trained Japanese historians. There's a bunch of them who think that maybe if you restrict certain geography, certain amount of time, you can get the number down to 50. So it's not 300,000, it's 50 people. Only 50 people were killed at Nanjing. So contest over naming, they don't call it the massacre, they call it the incident. So naming, numbers, geography, these are all aspects in terms of getting at the truth that have to be dealt with and controlled and contested. So the final mural, it's a little hard to see it here, but the final mural is extraordinary, because what it shows is the Japanese and all the people in history since 1937 who followed Japan. Japan was the first liberator, is the argument. Japan was the first liberator, and they influenced all these other people. They influenced Gandhi. The argument is that the Japanese did it first, save people from the yoke of imperialism. Gandhi followed. Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader in the United States, learned from the Japanese. And it's this nice airtight argument that the Japanese make in this shrine, which gets, I think it's 8 million people have visited it, 500 people a day, something like that. I mean, it's very popular. And if you go to Japan during any time when there are holidays, whatever, and you go in Tokyo, they travel around Tokyo with bullhorns and cars that make this argument. The right wing is making this argument all the time, and it's also unassailable politically. The last example I can give is one which is looking at a different process of truth-telling and of justice-making, and that is Cambodia. The example people often think of when they think of a genocide in Asia. And I give this map because if we think about why it is the Khmer Rouge did what they did in 1975 to 1979, this is the map, I think, which makes the point really, really powerfully. So Cambodia, right next to Vietnam, not part of the Vietnam experience at all. They were certainly part of the colonial control, but agricultural country, Cambodia was not developed. It was the rice basket, was not developed economically, industrially at all. But the argument was that there was material that was brought from North Vietnam to South Vietnam through Cambodia and required there to be aerial warfare, which is what the United States moved to after we supposedly left Vietnam, the de-Vietnamization. The Vietnamization of the war, and instead under Nixon basically came in aerial warfare. And you can see there were more bombs dropped on Cambodia than dropped on than Japan in all of World War II. And I'm just trying to kind of, figure out, historians try to ask, how something happened, what's the context of it. But if you think of being peasants in Cambodia, not part of the war, and then destruction rains from the sky, and look where the bombs are. One of the big problems you have in Cambodia today is unexploded ordnances, unexploded bombs that are there still in the ground. Very well-educated Cambodian intellectuals, teachers, professors, decided that modern times, this is what modern times brought, and they were not going to have any of it. They were going to go back to the great period of Cambodian history. And if you go to Cambodia, you see Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom. They're extraordinary. They really are wonders of the world. These extraordinary civilizations that existed there in the 9th to the 14th century. And so that was the glory of Cambodia, and the Khmer leaders, Khmer Rouge, the Red Khmers, wanted to go back to that period, and so emptied out the cities. So 1975, they came into power. No one could live in cities anymore. If you were in the hospital hooked up to tubes, you got put on a stretcher and left. Old people carried by their children. So you had to leave, and they wanted to take Cambodia back to when it was great and agricultural, and thought that it had enough people, you worked people, had them believe in the mission of Khmer Rouge, and you could make a great people again that was not taking the terrible things that were happening in modern times. As a result of this vision of it, between 1975 and 1979, between about 2 million of 8 in Cambodia died of being killed, starvation, deprivation, being worked to death, etc. And so then the question was, with that experience, the Vietnamese basically came in to stop the killing, which had started with intellectuals, anybody who didn't have calloused hands, but the targets changed between 75 and 79. So there was one group after another who were seen as enemies of the revolution and had to be killed, and numbering 2 million. The killing after that actually started with the Vietnamese. It's, no genocide they're all messy, they're all difficult. So who told the stories first were the Vietnamese people who saved Cambodia, an ancient enmity between Vietnam and Cambodia. And so what they did was to set up some sites. The first one, the main one that people know about, is in Phnom Penh. And this was a school, S21. There's an extraordinary movie of this. There's a film of some people who were involved in it that won the Oscar Award last year for documentary, The Act of Killing. This is where the people who are the most suspect were brought. About 20,000 people over the years. Only 7 people survived S-21. They were brought there. They were then buried in killing fields outside of Phnom Penh. And so those sites now have been turned into memorial sites that are extraordinarily powerful. One of the 7 who survived, who's in this film, S-21, lives on the grounds of S-21. And so for me, it was extraordinarily difficult, having seen him in the movie, to then go to the site and have him be living there and basically selling his book and taking tours of it. It was very difficult because he can only tell that story also. So you have the inside of it. It was a school where these cells were kind of thrown up. One of the things that is also very powerful, and it was true with the Gestapo, with the Nazis, it's true in many genocides, that people feel compelled to tell the story and to defend what they're doing by getting their own truth down. And what happened in Cambodia was that every single one of those 20,000 had their picture taken, and you see the 20,000 pictures up on the wall. And the other thing they did was they had to tell their story. They had to write down what their story was and to get it right, to demonstrate that they were enemies of the revolution. And so the second floor is filled with their stories, books of their stories. And so this is very raw, and Cambodia is going through a tribunal right now, which is, again, very difficult and powerful. Maybe there will be 3 people at the end who are convicted in that. But the final image in terms of this next step that we're hopefully moving to, so that there'll be Nunkama, so it won't happen again. The next step in terms of reconciliation is one I want to share. I was able to go to the tribunal in Cambodia, and there Cambodians have been able to, differently from here, have been able to confront the people who made the policy. So the first person who was convicted was the fellow who was in charge of the museum. He actually was extremely contrite. So as people were able to confront him, and there were 8,000 people who applied to be civil parties, a category which had not been used in other tribunals necessarily, they were able to face, just inches away from him, tell him what they had experienced, their parents had experienced, their families had experienced. And he actually was quite contrite. He was asking for forgiveness, this notion of reconciliation, closure, forgiveness. He was actually begging the people who came and said to him. The second person, no, and this is where it's been much more difficult. The second person was the person who actually made the policy. He was number 2 under Pol Pot. Pol Pot died. Number 2. And there's a story by a journalist who had hundreds of hours of interview with number 2 called Beyond the Killing Fields. And it's chilling because this man says, yes, this is a policy I made. Given the chance again, I would do exactly the same thing. If there were any excesses, it wasn't me, but he defends what he did to the end. Much more difficult. So Cambodians who are facing him and crying and telling them their story, he is implacable. But yet they are able to, just inches away from his face, tell him what they experienced. So Cambodians have been coming by the thousands. They line up when the tribunal is happening. This has been extraordinarily cathartic and a really important process. Taken a long time to get there, but it is happening, and there's something coming out of this process that had not been expected. Let me end with the last image, because I know this whole notion of reconciliation, of coming to terms with the past is extraordinarily difficult. People, oftentimes Holocaust people say absolutely not possible to forgive, but if we want to get to Nunca Mas, to never again, We have to have the truth-telling. We have to have the justice. What comes after that? Share with you is one that moved me in Asia, in Japan, the most, and that was going to Ground Zero. In Hiroshima, there's a museum to history which says basically the Hiroshima people are peace-loving, and this happens to be a military garrison, but they say they were always peace-loving. So that's their history and their history museum. Then they have a peace park and a memorial site for the stories of people who went through it. But it was intended as a place for people to talk about peace, but basically at ground zero. So you were supposed to feel the victimization of the Japanese in that case and how they were victimized in their pain and the great difficulty, the extraordinary things they had to experience as the only people who have had an atomic bomb dropped on them. But there's a legend in Japan that if you fold, let me pass this, that if you fold 100 paper cranes, origami cranes, that you'll live 100 years. I'm sorry, 1,000, you'll live 100 years. And there was a little girl in 1955 who developed leukemia. She had been 2 years old, she'd been in Hiroshima, outside of Hiroshima, a couple of miles, and so she had not she survived, seemed to have good health, but in 1955 she developed leukemia. And so a colleague of hers, a friend of hers, told her that if she folded 1,000 cranes that she would be able to live. And so she set about, no one's not clear exactly how many she folded, but she did die. And a children's book was made about her, Sadako and 1,000 Cranes. And so the Japanese constructed a monument to her. And, as an American, this site, the whole site, Ground Zero, was extraordinarily difficult. In my class, I bring up Hiroshima as a possible genocide to my students. We wrangle over that. And all these sites were very difficult. But the most extraordinary site was what has happened to this site. This is a site which was added to the Peace Park, which is to Sadako and the 1,000 Cranes. And you can see around it, there are these streamers of 1,000 crane, origami cranes. And what has happened in this site is there's been kind of a movement by people around the world to do something with it that was not planned. But you go there, and in the middle of this park are these thousands and thousands and thousands of strings of paper cranes that people around the world have folded and brought there. Children's groups, adult groups, there are all sorts of projects around the world bringing it. And so there is something out of this this agony and pain and impossible beyond words. There's something else happening there, and I wept. I mean, it was really extraordinarily powerful to be there and to see something else coming out of that experience. And you really see it in this unplanned image of the 1,000 cranes that are being brought there, and seeing them in their color blowing in the breeze is extraordinarily powerful. So let me end there. Actually, I'd end with one other quote. Noam Chomsky, who is a public intellectual, leftist writer, critic in the United States, was asked about what you do and why he does what he does. And he said basically that even if there is just the slightest chance of making a difference, the slightest chance of making the smallest difference, he said, you must do it. You must do it. He feels compelled, explaining why he is a man of boundless energy, fighting for his causes. And he said, the slightest chance to do anything, and you have to do it. So let me end with that and open it now up to your comments. Thank you.
Let's open the floor. Let's do it this way. We'll have a set of questions, and then we'll see how it goes. So who wants to go first? Please. Ambassador Munshi Faiz, please.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, I go
The
first
mic.
because... Thank you, Professor. Yes, I go first because I need to go off. So I'm
Sorry.
excited that I'll say a few things. First, thank you, Professor Imtiaz and Professor Gronewold, for this very useful lecture that will bring a lot of thoughts into our minds. That is the purpose, I believe, and because you have served that purpose very well. Knowing Professor Imtiaz, I believe you might have already done it. If you have not, then I would suggest that you look, you see the small documentary, if I can call it, called Stop Genocide by Zahir, which was made during the
I was wondering, trying to take it along another line in terms of, there are also counter memories and how evaluation what the government looking from a particular political ideology, how you get influenced by counter memories. For instance, I've been to this school in Cambodia and we talked to some of the people around after seeing the exhibits, and they said, but these people were not being tried effectively because many of the bureaucrats who were there then doing this are still in running offices. And then again, I was thinking about the Tokyo Tribunal, and when that was held in Tokyo and the comfort women were brought there, the number of people who actually came in support, as opposed to that, the larger number of people seem to be organized outside the premises. To say that this was a big conspiracy against Japan.
Let's take one more and then we'll ask Sue to respond. Who wants to go next? Yes, please.
Well, it's just a purely academic question. It's very wonderful that we have a Center for Genocide Studies at Dhaka University. That's congratulated. I don't know who organized it, who planned it, but it's very good. But I think this is much more widely studied in the USA about genocide, that kind of things. What kind of impact does it produce upon the young mind? And after all, we are all longing for peace and that kind of things. But human beings they behave different. What we expect, but they will not do that. But we had a very terrible experience in 1961. We cannot forget. We will not forget for many, many years. But I'm just wondering, what is the impact we have there, and what we can do in the suffering. Our case is a bit different. We have a lot of communal violence, and that kind of things. And now the fundamental struggle. This is a different scenario. But the result is the same. People die. They die for nothing, and die for bad cause, and peace is destroyed. Thank you. Would you like to make it up? So,
Well, since I'm going to scroll again, we start with this last one because it's very complicated, actually. And I think, yes, you do have interest in studying about the Holocaust and genocide in the Holocaust in particular. And my university did not want to, they said, suggest even take it beyond the Holocaust. Several of us who said, no, we have to bring in other experiences. I think there's even more searching for an understanding of it in Europe, and particularly the Germans have done an enormous amount of memory work, whatever you want to call it, and certainly very differently. The contrast, if you think about comparative, the contrast between Germany and Japan is so stark. The Japanese, not talking, they thought themselves the victims. The Japanese not really searching. But the Germans have really looked inside and done a lot of searching of why it was this happened, this thing that we call by a different name, this genocide. So there, I think they've been fairly a model, if you will, around the world of how people who were perpetrators of it can go about looking inside and seeing what the cause of it was. Now, last year there was a study that was shocking in its extent, looking at how many death places there were in Germany, and find out numbers. The numbers that the historians have thought was maybe about 7,000 or so, and the number that they come up with is 42,000 places where there had been camps, ghettos for the work camps, extermination camps. 42,000. You can't then say that Germans didn't know. So even with all of that memory work, you still have Austrians say, oh, we didn't know, it was done somebody else did it, we didn't know about it. Can't say that anymore, the 42,000. So even with the amount of memory work they've done, there still is forgetting, denying. I train a lot of teachers in my university, and a lot of teachers are in this program. One of the questions that we ask a lot is, how do you instill memory of this in people who didn't go through it? A kind of vicarious understanding of it. And it's extraordinarily difficult. Even with a requirement that every teacher talk about the Holocaust in schools, there is no easy way for the students to not claim it. They've heard about it. There's a term, actually, in education about this called Holocaust fatigue. What the teachers do is they will show, there's a film Shoah, they'll show the film Shoah and say, okay, we've done it. In the past, what they would do is bring in survivors. Well, survivors are beginning to die. There aren't many survivors. So they bring in survivors who tell their stories, and you get to listen to the stories, and then say, hold on, we've heard that story, we know it. So how you do that for succeeding generations is extremely difficult for people. Now, it didn't happen in the United States. The survivors came to the United States, so it's doubly removed. How you do people who are doubly removed is really difficult. I don't have that sense that that's an issue here. It's not an issue here. The young people seem to be propelling a lot of this knowledge and remembering in Latin America, in Argentina, in Chile, in Uruguay, in Peru. It's young people who are saying, Mom and Dad, you may have said military period, we have to move on. We're not moving on. And I was just told that last week there was a big mural at the University of Buenos Aires that was opened up, that was dedicated. They had a little plaque. Students said, look, a lot of people who were killed were students at the University of Buenos Aires. And said, a little plaque for it. And the students said, that's not enough, a little plaque. And they just unveiled a huge mural was saying it was students from here, and we have to name them, we have to acknowledge it, and we have to do that hard work of QFUN. So it's actually propelled by students in many places. But in the United States, it's very, we talk about this a lot. If they themselves hadn't heard it from their family members, if it's at 1, 2, 3, it's removed, how to have them think about it seriously, is extraordinarily difficult. I don't have an easy answer for it. I'm an educator, so I have to believe, it's like Noam Chomsky said, I have to believe it make a little difference, that I got to do it, but I'm not optimistic about doing it very well. Mr. Masser's question about scale, and we thought about what kinds of things have to be there for it to reach the level. You want, and the thing is, you want to be called genocide, you want there to be a high bar, right? We don't use the term discriminate. And so one of the factors that's identified is scale. And I think it's got to be massive. It can't, and over some time. And I think the other part of the definition that kind of helps us with the scale is that it should be the systematic, deliberate way of trying to get rid of, exterminate, get rid of people. So there's no number. Large, it should be massive, systematic, and a people. Which begs the question then, what's people? The Holocaust, the Genocide Convention does give certain categories of how to define people, not just ethnic, but it should be the attempt to get rid of a group. And then actually the convention says in whole or in part, and it also includes cultural, if identification of the people culturally, if you erase that. So, for example, in Australia, so indigenous people whose culture was taken away, whose children were taken by white people to be educated and to have the indigenous part of their culture erased. That's considered also within the genocide by the convention. It should be massive, is that, but there's no number that makes genocide one number, genocide one number not. In terms of the question of collateral damage, of course, and this is a term Americans like to use, and not an easy one. And certainly, there are arguments made that this could possibly be genocide. And in fact, one of the kind of forefronts, one of the frontiers of thinking about genocide now is really calling into question whether deliberate, that this whole notion of being of intent and deliberate, systematic, that you could have genocide even if there were not an original intent, that you could have all the other perpetrators, victims, massive scales, and people who are exterminated. And there again, the Native American indigenous peoples fall in that category also. And it's a way to say, these people are gone. And, the genocide has to apply to them as well. So, I think this is one area which we'll see a lot of thinking in. And you can no longer say, sorry, we didn't intend it, stuff happens, etc. Counter-memories, is extremely complex. We were talking earlier about this notion of memories and whose memory, who claims them. What I'm thinking of very, very visually is this Indonesian film, The Act of Killing, which won an Oscar. And I just saw at the New York Film Festival a second film made by this fellow, Josh Oppenheimer, called The Sounds of Silence. And what he does is he takes Josh Oppenheimer, who made the film Act of Killing, about the million plus who were killed in 1965 in Indonesia. Again, a genocide. No one acknowledges. Nobody, the Indonesians won't talk about it. He actually was taking his life in his hands and his crew's life in their hands by making a movie of it. It's just not discussed in Indonesia at all. And what he was able to do was get people who actually perpetrated this to, on camera, reenact what they did with great fervor. They don't challenge. They are totally convinced that what they did was right, and he, in an extraordinarily chilling way, got them to reenact what they had done in 1965. The second film, The Sounds of Silence, is a young man who was on his film crew, a young Indonesian guy whose brother had been there. And he decided in making this film with Oppenheimer that he wanted to do what no one in his family had ever done, was to find out what happened. And on camera, you see him in a very careful way, not abrasive, but in a very careful way, just continuing to ask these people who had been filmed telling their stories, and just asking them, well, what happened, what happened. And his brother had been killed in a way that everybody in the community knew. Everybody knew about it. But the amount of denial, even though there were images on tape of these people saying what they had done, the family members, the wife, the children say, oh, you didn't do that. And the fellow who had actually killed him had drawn pictures, had made an album. But the family members said, oh no, this didn't happen. So this notion of memory and who claims it, who names it, whose memory and counter-memories is extremely complicated. And how to get at the truth is certainly not an easy process. And we have someone like Jan who says, I have to tell the story. I have to tell the story. And people have to feel, as the Bangladeshi people at King University feel comfortable in getting their stories out. And the other thing which I want to say, because we did talk about it, I want to emphasize it, is that I'm so impressed by the Liberation War Museum, which does tell women's stories. And I think that's unusual. It's only been recently, and with the Yugoslav cases, that rape has been considered an act of war. This is, my student didn't grab rape, it's all that sense. Wait just a minute. This has been done by people, for millennia. It is about power. It's about, this is an act of war, which has now been accepted. But I'm very impressed that the Liberation War Museum does have the women's story front and center, and that's really unusual for it to be told in that way. And I was impressed by that in 2009, and even more impressed when I saw that it's really a theme through the whole museum. It's really to be congratulated in getting that story out and saying this is not, women were part of it. They were fighters. They were involved in it in all different ways, and that's always been true of women in war. Women have been involved, but to acknowledge it in all its complexity and difficulty. These are hard stories for people to tell, families to hear. But you have really grappled with it in a way that many people have not. So thank you.
Will hold the future, or there is other ways that we need to think about to capture the memories and to retain those. Thank you.
Yes, Masood?
As a historian, how do you describe the issues of Red Indians in America, and do you have any plan to research on this genocide on Red Indians? That's my question.
Okay. Go ahead, third and then fifth.
Verify the fact from whatever we hear and whatever we discover from the history books. Let me give you one example. At least you have some knowledge about 1971. If you go to India, you will see different pictures. So Indians will be claiming that 71 is our own credit. And if you go to Pakistan, you get a different scenario. They will say that, they have been misleading the nation, they have been creating a chaos, so that's why we have to defend our own country. And if you want to see the real world scenario, you have to come to Bangladesh. Now my concern is, how to verify or justify the fact from the real, actual history from usual history. Thank you.
Shall we have one more?
আমার যেটা প্রস্তাব সেটা হচ্ছে যে উনি যেই মেমোরিয়াল স্কুলে ঢাকা ছিলেন সেখানে আগে আমার পরিচয়টা নেই আমার নাম কাউসার, পুরো নাম কাউসার চৌধুরী। আমার সৌভাগ্য হয়েছিল ঢাকা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে এই গণহত্যাটি হয়েছিল সেটার উপরে ডকুমেন্টারি নির্মাণ করা। আমি নিজেই করেছিলাম। সেই ছবিটার নাম হচ্ছে সেই রাতের কথা বলতে এসেছি। আপনারা কেউ এখানে দেখেছেন কিনা জানি না, অনেক হয়তো দেখেছেন। এটার ইংলিশ ভার্সন আছে, you can see in YouTube even. Tale of the Darkest Night. It's a documentary on genocide done by Pakistani Army in 19. It's a documentary on genocide done by Pakistani Army on 25th March here in this Dhaka University. Anyway, তো ওই অভিজ্ঞতার প্রেক্ষিতে as I was a student, one of the student at the university, and I own this university, and I own this soil. As a son of the soil, আমি যেটা ফিল করি সেটা ঢাকা ইউনিভার্সিটি, আমাদের সময় এত কিছু ছিল না। আমার একজন ডাইরেক্টর স্যার এখানটায় আছেন, আমি ইসলামিক হিস্ট্রিতে পড়তাম, জার্নালিস্টে পড়তাম, কিন্তু স্যার তো আমার খুব কাছেই। তো আমার কথা হচ্ছে যে যেহেতু আপনাদের ডিপার্টমেন্ট হয়ে গেছে, এখন ডকুমেন্টেশনগুলোর জন্য বাইরে থেকে আমাদের মতো ডকুমেন্টারি মেকার নিয়ে না এসে ডিপার্টমেন্ট থেকে যদি ডকুমেন্টারি মেকার তৈরি করা যায়, ফলে যে কাজটা হবে অন্যজন এসে ওন করা, এটা টেকনিকগুলো বুঝতে পারা, হোয়াট ইজ কল্ড জেনোসাইড, হাউ ইজ ইট, হোয়াটস দ্য গালা, এসব ব্যাপারগুলো ওখান থেকে সে ফিল করে ভেতর থেকে যদি করতে পারে, একটা সাংঘাতিক একটি ব্যাপার। এক নম্বর। দু নম্বর হচ্ছে যে ওয়েবসাইটটা আপনার আজকাল অনেক পুরনো হয়ে গেছে, সেই ব্যাপারগুলো যদি পুরো অডিও ভিজুয়াল ব্যাপারটা যদি এমন করা হয় যে সারা পৃথিবী থেকে যে কোনো জায়গায় বসে ঢাকা ইউনিভার্সিটি সম্পর্কে বা জেনোসাইড সম্পর্কে ক্লিক করলে সে ওখানটায় ভিজুয়ালসগুলো পেয়ে যাবে উইথ রেফারেন্স। নাম্বার 3 হচ্ছে যে ঢাকা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে আমি দেখেছি এত বছর পরেও, 43 বছরের পর বছরেও এখানে যেমন উনি ছবিগুলো দেখাচ্ছিলেন একজন একজন প্রত্যেকের ছবিগুলো, আমার মনে হয় না যে ঢাকা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে যারা শহীদ হয়েছে তাদের ছবিগুলো এখনো পর্যন্ত আছে কিনা। শুধু কলা ভবনের সামনে একটা লম্বা করে লিস্ট দেওয়া আছে, সেই লিস্ট যারা খুবই আগ্রহী কিংবা গবেষণা করে তারা ওখানে হয়তো খুঁটে খুঁটে ম্যাগনিফাইং গ্লাস দিয়ে পড়বে, বাট রেস্ট অফ দ্য পিপল উইল নট গো ফর রিয়েলি টেকিং দিস সর্ট অফ ট্রাভেল। ইন দ্যাট কেস আমাদের যেহেতু অডিও ভিজুয়াল মিডিয়া অনেক বেশি সহজ, সেই ক্ষেত্রে এইসব ব্যাপারগুলোই অনেক বেশি আধুনিকভাবে প্রযুক্তিতে নিয়ে এসে করা যায় কিনা। 5 নম্বর ব্যাপার হচ্ছে যে খুব বেশি সময় নিয়ে অনেক বেশি যেই জায়গাগুলোতে গণহত্যাগুলো ঘটেছিল সেই জায়গাগুলো হারিয়ে যাচ্ছে। কয়েকদিন পরে 43 বছরের মাথায় আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি 1971 আমি পার্টিসিপেট করেছি, আমি তখন ম্যাট্রিকের ক্যান্ডিডেট। 43 বছরের মাথায় এসে তো এখন প্রশ্ন এসে যাচ্ছে আদৌ স্বাধীনতা তখন যুদ্ধ হয়েছিল কিনা, আর কয়েক বছর পরে কি অবস্থা হবে। সুতরাং ঢাকা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে জানি প্রতি পদে পদে প্রতি 10 গজ পর পর গণহত্যা হয়েছিল। এখন প্রতি 10 গজ পর পর যে এক একটা করে স্ট্যাচু করতে যে একটু হাঁটতে পারবে না, আই নো, কিন্তু যেসব জায়গাগুলোতে হয়েছিল বড় রকমের ম্যাচ আকার হয়েছিল, যেমন জগন্নাথ হল, জহুরুল হক হল, যেটা ইকবাল হক হল, রোকেয়া হলের সামনে, মাঠটাতে, শিববাড়িতে, উল্টা দিকে টিচার্স কোয়ার্টার গুলোতে, শহীদ মিনার উল্টা দিকে এবং অন্যান্য জায়গায় যেহেতু সেগুলোতে এমন কোনো স্মৃতি করে রাখা যায় কিনা যেটা সহজে একজন স্টুডেন্ট যে নতুন আসবে কিংবা একজন পথচারী একজন মানুষ গিয়েই যেন প্রথম প্রশ্ন করে হোয়াট ইজ দিস, তার মনে যেন একটি প্রশ্ন আসে, তারপরে সে ডিটেইলে আসবে যে কি হয়েছিল না হয়েছিল, এবং সেখানে একটা অডিও ভিজুয়াল প্রেজেন্টেশন রেখে দেওয়া, সেই জন্য গিয়ে কাউকে কোনো কিছু জিজ্ঞেস না করে ওখানে ক্লিক করে অটোমেটিক্যালি সে যে পুরো ব্যাপারটা জেনে নিতে পারে। এই ব্যাপারগুলো আমার প্রস্তাব রইল। আমরা তো সবসময় এসে আপনাদেরকে বলতে পারবো না, এটা আমার বিনীত নিবেদন রইল আপনাদের কাছে। And thank you very much to you, and I'm really sorry as I'm not good at English in that case. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me take one more and then we'll ask you to respond, and I'll respond to your, please go.
Well, this is a very sensitive topic for me actually. It's something which I think is a bit frustrating as well. And being a student, it's hard for me to see that, like we see that organizations all around the world, and I see so many genocides happen. It's frustrating. Like, the question I have, I'm always thinking about this, so I get a shake. And I talk about this, like, after the Second World War, I mean, we have had the organization UN, the British organization. I mean, that's so many genocides. And my question is, do you find that, like, this organization or whatever authorities in power, are they doing their job? Sorry, I'm being shaky, but it's
No,
a
sorry.
very sensitive topic. And,
Sure.
yes.
Yeah, I'm sure to got that very well.
No, and in terms of where genocide thinkers talking about it and work on it are going, one of the areas, as you maybe know, is that there's a whole discussion about preventing genocide and predicting genocide. So this is an area, again, very, very, very complicated, but that there are certain behaviors that we can't allow. And is there some way to identify, and there's a lot of people identifying a certain number of factors, and if those factors are there, and social scientists are doing this, social scientists are doing this, and natural relations people are doing this, who are social scientists, who can supposedly predict they sit at different from historians. Historians don't predict, but this side of the room does. And can we scientifically say these are all the factors that exist, and if we can identify those factors, then can we do something to prevent it from happening? The problem with that is that it's not a precise science, number one. These are precise sciences. And that in order to do that, you have to basically violate other principles, particularly sovereignty. But there is this whole field now of arguing that countries have the right to protect their people, and if they don't, then there is intervention is justified. Extraordinarily difficult goal and project, but that is a very powerful area now of people thinking about genocide. I'm not quite sure in which form I said it. What I like to think of, actually, in terms of preventing is not necessarily, when Samantha Young talks about it, when she talks about military solutions. So Americans like to talk about, if you go in a military lane, that will do it. And time and time again, that's not the way to do it, but she has written about this a lot. The counter image that I like to bring up is, and there's a very fine article written about Kofi Annan, who was brought into a very tense situation in Kenya a few years ago. And possibly genocide in the making, and two groups squared off against each other, and people observing it outside said, this is really heated, it could explode within a minute. And Kofi Annan, well-respected, so this was in Africa, and a well-respected statesman, and what he did was he took the statements that had been made by these two groups. It's an extraordinary process. And he basically said, he worked with them sentence by sentence, word by word, and got them. And it was a master of what a wise, well-regarded, respectful person can do, not militarily, but get people to work together. And by the end of the process, and he traveled backward. By the end of the process, he got them to agree on a document. But it was extraordinarily difficult and painful, but it did not involve a military solution. And to me, as Noam Chomsky, if you could do that, not easy, extraordinary difficult, but the fact that he could do that, to me is a little bit of hope. So I leave you with that thought. I mean, it's very, very powerful. So I urge you to read about that. The notion of museums, memories, the issue of history being written by the victors. A lot of people talk about memories and how to keep them, where to lodge them. There was a lot of talk about collective memory, but a writer who I'm very, very impressed by, James Young, who's written a lot about memorials, and is this fellow's architect. He talks about collective memories in the plural, and of all parties, collective memories. And I think that, to me, as an historian, that is really another thing that has to be done, is the voices, all kinds of voices, have to be gathered and kept. The other thing about these memorial sites, and I didn't go into it all, is that these memorial sites are not fixed. Every single one of these has gone through renovation. And each time, each decade or so, they're changed. The emphasis changes, in part because there are more collected memories, so we learn more and more. I mean, that 42,000 number of sites, that's about happened in 1938 in Germany. Now that number is coming out. So for me, it's really an appeal to my profession, to historians, to keep digging, to not give up, to keep revising as the information comes out. This is not a fixed process. And as I said, the best memorial sites and museums are ones that change and reflect the greater number of memories. It's not just museums. The other thing, and I didn't go into it, but there are lots of different places and ways to keep these memories. The memorial, the testimonies, the books that are collected of people's stories, literature, the arts. I had dinner last night with one of your well-known theater people who has a play now, Mr. Rashid, a play on 1971. And the argument is that there are things you can do on stage, in film, with poetry, with murals, with the arts that you can't do with words. So you can collect memories in lots of different ways and express memories in lots of different ways. So I would argue for exploring all these different ways of memory making, memory collecting, of getting at the truth and keeping the truth. So it's museums, it's memorials, it's art, it's music, it's theater, it's museum, it's archives. There's a huge range of ways to keep it collect and display it. Finally, the issue in terms of remembering and forgetting in memories of Native Americans. In my classes in our program, we actually have one of the areas that we study, that we have students study, is Native American genocide. And the word has been used. There's a validated standard for a book called American Holocaust, that you can talk about genocide, you can talk about Native American indigenous people. And there, this notion of the question of intent has been stretched. Americans don't like, North Americans don't like, South Americans too, in places that are indigenous people don't like to talk about it, or they say, well, it was the Germans that did it. But no, the Bolivians and Peruvians had an extraordinary agricultural system that was very fine-tuned with potatoes at the top of the mountains, and the Spanish came with their horses and destroyed it. Did they say, I'm going to destroy the agriculture? Well, I don't know that they did. They didn't have to for it to be genocide, I think. So this is something that is definitely in the range to be analyzed. And I guess my final appeal is that these programs, ours, which is a fairly new master's program, that I would argue Holocaust, genocide, and then I argue, sometimes alone in it, but I argue that we really should expand it to human rights, because of human rights thinking, which has developed, and the mechanisms, the international law, the international mechanisms are developing, that these programs proliferate, and that the program now at University of Dhaka, which is 3 months, that it be expanded. Because these are, tough issues that we have to deal with, have to grapple with the memories making, the forgetting, the denial, and then try to move to making at least a little difference. So, thank you.
Okay. We have 2 more, and then
genocide studies. How do you, as an educator, keep that balance of what you want to preach and what the state wants you to preach? Especially that CGS is here in University of Dhaka, a state-run university.
okay, the last one, please.
This is Saddam Hussein, Department of International Relations. My question is a little bit different, but it is related with genocide. the case studies during the liberation of Bangladesh, we see that Pakistan did a massive massacre in our country by killing general people. But strategically, why USA supported Pakistan? This is my question.
You not get away with that. Okay, who wants to
That may be some people here from the U.S. Embassy. I pass it on. I know nothing about it, but I just pass it on to my supporters.
We sponsored David, but that wasn't
Actually, I asked the same question to Leon Levin. He answered that I was questioning him when he was documenting our liberation war in the border and some other sites. At the same time, his government was taking preparation for sending their 7 fleets against us. So, what's the relation or what's the difference between real Levin and the government? And he answered, actually, this is the difference between rural people and the government. What government is thinking, the general people might not go through that way. That is my reason to you.
Well, in fact, that puts together two questions. Two questions really do fit together, right? How do we deal with these issues in state universities and, program. There have been recently, there's this very powerful book that was just written about the blood program, which is documenting, what, it's not a surprise to many people, but the role of the United States. And, as an historian that deals with China, what was happening, in the background of many of these cases, right? It was the U.S. was playing the China card. And, obviously the person from the center of that is Mr. Kissinger. So, recently, the book material coming out of that Cuba, retired public school teacher, and she dedicated her life now to following Mr. Kissinger around. And wherever he appears, Stephanie is there, basically saying, it kind of depends on the day. The banner could be, it could be Bangladesh, it could be, Cambodia. That the architect of U.S. foreign policy, stands to be, responsible for many of these situations. So a lot of it was about, China front and center, and making sure that China is, and Cold War. These are Cold War phenomena. And I have no problem. I have no problem in my classroom of really arguing, that I don't have a curriculum which I have to follow. These are courses that I've developed myself. So I can develop this. I can be as critical as I want to about U.S. foreign policy, and I see that that's my job actually, as a historian, to make sure that my students know that and are aware of, and also make another argument for world history. That you can't just learn it by learning your own country's history or one country's history. It's when you put the whole story together and you see this in the context of the whole that it really makes sense. And so, we have to look at that, and the next generation has to be aware as well.
One some of the things that we have been saying is in pipeline, to be very honest. And documentary is one of the things that we will be doing. We will also have a translation unit in fact. We'll be translating all the major English works on 71. It took 40 years, but you have to give some time for the center. I wish it was established back in 72. Then probably a lot of things would have been resolved by now. One of the things that we have been doing with the first 51 students is that they have been asked or assigned to collect one oral history. And this will go through a process called authenticization. We are familiar with the oral history methodology. They are trained now, and from there we believe at least even if 50% are good enough, that will be the starting point of collecting oral history on a very scientific
basis with all the things that involve in collecting memories. So that's one part of it. The second one, if you quickly go through my book on 71, the genocide, you will see that I make a distinction between state and person, in fact. It's very important. State has its own compulsion. State has different ways of looking at genocide, but person has a totally different way of looking at genocide. So I will, request you to read my book on historicizing genocide, which actually on Dhaka University, and it will show how different the state compulsions and person compulsion is. And that takes you to Tagore's fantastic line which Gandhi used to cite on and off, and that is, if no one hits your call, then go alone. That's very important. So the issue that, or the thing that we are saying, particularly whether we can have the mapping of the places, I think this is some young generation can easily take up. In fact, with the technology that we have, it's so easy now to do it and start working on it. In the etc. You can make a map, in fact, and then you go area by area. You can do it at home actually with the technology you have. There are enough books, and then you interview people. There are fantastic people in this room, the freedom fighter, Shirin Hawk has worked, Hamida. You just talk to them and they can come with 20 places immediately. That is back in Mafidul Hawk, you tell him 50 places. So you can, you put them on the spots and then you build on that. In fact, these are the things I always say that young couples can make, and as I say, we will be starting a fellowship, and this is something that is also in our mind. If somebody wants to give a project of that kind, we will be definitely funding whatever that is required. On the last issue of US in 71, you have to be very careful, in fact, because Bangladesh post 71 also has a darker side. If you take Ramu, and if you take the minority bashing, and if you take the CHT, and I always say the problem is those who go through the suffering of genocide internalizes, the genocidal elements, in fact. And part of the problem that we see in Israel, for example, and Gaza, they have probably internalized, in fact, I would say, not that many problems internalize the suffering that he or his generations have gone through. And some of us, in fact, we also have gone through. You see the very serious violence between A and B. I don't want to name the A and B. I'm sure you know. A and B. It is absolutely ferocious, in fact. And I don't know how they do it, in fact. They kill. They know they're killing, and sometimes they use what the bus fire, if you remember. That tells you that people have internalized, in fact. And I see young people have actually internalized, and that's the bothering, in fact. So the Center for Genocide is not, well, genocide and mass violence is the mandate, and as I said, one of our immediate, probably in January, we'll start with advanced course on human rights. So we will be trying our best, but as Sue said, citing Chomsky, a little step is good enough, in fact, a little change, in fact. You can't change humans in one day, but if you can change 2 people or 3 people, I think that's good enough. And so, with that, note, thank you very much, Sue. I hope you enjoyed. You stay here, and I'm sure